They told you the world would make room for you if you worked hard enough, stayed humble enough, waited enough, and proved your value without making anyone uncomfortable. So you learned to be careful. You learned to soften your instincts before you spoke. You learned to package your ambition in polite language and your disappointment in silence. You learned to explain other people's behavior in ways that protected their image, even when that image kept costing you something. And while you were busy trying to be fair, trying to be liked, trying to be understood, another lesson was quietly being taught around you. People were learning what they could do in your presence without consequence. That is where the real story begins. Not at the dramatic betrayal, not at the obvious insult, not at the moment someone finally crossed a line so openly that even you could no longer defend it. It begins much earlier, in smaller moments, where the evidence is easier to dismiss and the damage is easier to rename. Someone interrupts you and you let it pass because you do not want to seem sensitive. Someone uses your attention but disappears when your needs appear. Someone jokes at your expense, delays their respect, withholds clarity, or gives you just enough warmth to keep you invested while steadily teaching you that your discomfort can survive unattended. None of these moments seem large enough to justify a rupture. That is exactly why they matter. The line is rarely destroyed by one act. It is dissolved by repetition. Most people think disrespect begins when another person becomes bold. Often it begins when they become certain. Certain that you will explain, certain that you will absorb, certain that your standards are more verbal than structural, certain that your need to preserve harmony is stronger than your willingness to impose friction. Human beings do not always cross a boundary because they are cruel enough to attack it. Many cross it because they no longer believe it is real. They study hesitation more carefully than principle. They trust what your behavior permits more than what your mouth declares. And once a pattern starts teaching them that your pain stays private while their access stays, they stop asking whether they should continue. They start assuming they can. That assumption changes everything. It changes the tone of a relationship before a conflict is named. It changes how a workplace uses the reliable person, how a friendship leans on the giver, how a family assigns the role of absorber, how an intimate bond begins surviving on ambiguity, because one person keeps translating instability into complexity instead of calling it what it is. People like to imagine that these patterns are mysterious. They are not. They are slow. That is what makes them dangerous. Slowness keeps the ego comfortable. Slowness allows denial to dress itself as patience. Slowness gives you time to mistake your self-betrayal for maturity. And this is where most advice becomes useless. It tells you to speak up more, love yourself more, be more confident, stop caring what people think. But the problem is deeper than performance. You can say all the right words and still be easy to move against if your inner image of yourself is unstable. You can announce boundaries and still collapse them at the first sign of tension if those boundaries came from exhaustion rather than identity. You can sound strong in a calm moment and become negotiable the instant connection feels threatened. People can feel that split even if they cannot explain it. They can feel when your no is a principle and when it is only a protest. That is why changing the way you think about yourself is not some decorative self-help slogan. It is not about feeling superior. It is not about pretending to be untouchable. It is about removing invisible permission. It is about ending the quiet cooperation between your longing and the people who benefited from it. The world does not suddenly rearrange itself because you wake up inspired one morning. It rearranges when your self-image stops telling others that your limits can be negotiated slowly enough. It rearranges when your behavior begins carrying a message your explanations never could. It rearranges when other people discover that access to you now has terms, and those terms are not written in moods, fear, guilt, or hope. They are written in structure. That shift rarely looks dramatic from the outside. It often begins with an uncomfortable silence inside you, a silence where you stop defending what your perception has already judged, a silence where you stop demanding one final piece of evidence before honoring the 10 you already had, a silence where you stop calling confusion depth, stop calling endurance loyalty, stop calling delay wisdom, and stop treating your own unease like a courtroom case that needs one perfect witness before action becomes allowed. You begin to see something simple. People reveal what they think of your standards long before they confess what they think of you. Once you see that, you cannot return to innocence. You cannot keep telling yourself the world is merely misunderstanding you. Sometimes it is, but often, the deeper problem is more severe. The world understood you too well. It understood your guilt. It understood your fear of appearing harsh. It understood your habit of carrying the hidden cost of everyone else's inconsistency. It understood that you would rather suffer familiar tension than risk the identity crisis of becoming harder to use. And the people who kept pushing were not always brilliant or powerful. Many were simply observant. They noticed the places where you were not fully on your own side. That is the wound beneath the wound. Not only what they did, but what your old self-image kept making affordable. Not only the line they crossed, but the line you kept redrawing after they crossed it. Not only the pain of being misread, but the pain of realizing you had been broadcasting the wrong terms of entry into your life. From this point forward, the dangerous thing about this process is how ordinary it looks while it is developing. There is no dramatic music. There is no villain introducing himself with a confession. There are just tiny adjustments happening in real time, and nearly all of them favor the person who acts on small information faster. Where you keep collecting evidence, someone else keeps converting your hesitation into access. Where you keep asking whether you are overreacting, they keep noticing the delay between what you feel and what you enforce. That delay becomes territory. The one who moves first in perception often controls the emotional climate, and if you keep postponing clarity, another person will eventually organize themselves around that postponement. This is why so many damaging dynamics survive on fragments, not on truth, but on pieces. A partial apology, a short burst of warmth after a long stretch of distance, a moment of vulnerability right when you are close to leaving, a promise with no structure behind it, a little more charm after repeated carelessness. These fragments are effective because they do not have to repair the pattern. They only have to interrupt your conclusion. They keep you emotionally engaged without requiring the other person to become consistent. Meanwhile, the structure underneath remains unchanged. One person keeps consuming certainty. The other keeps producing it at personal cost. In that system, ambiguity becomes a weapon. Clear disrespect can be confronted. Ambiguous disrespect is harder because it traps you between perception and guilt. You sense the imbalance, but you do not want to be unfair. You notice the withdrawal, the sarcasm, the delay, the selective affection. The way your usefulness is welcomed more quickly than your truth, yet you keep waiting for one clean moment that makes action feel morally perfect. While you wait, the other person learns. They learn how much confusion you can carry before you stop translating it. They learn how many times you will soften a boundary with explanation. They learn whether your anger appears grounded or apologetic. They learn whether your disappointment changes access or only gives them another emotional scene to survive. This does not happen only in romance. It happens in friendships where emotional labor travels one direction for years and gets renamed as closeness. It happens in families where one person becomes the regulator for everyone else's instability and gets praised for being mature. It happens in workplaces where the competent person becomes the silent carrier of everyone else's disorder because reliability, without protection, attracts more extraction than respect. It happens anywhere. One person is known as generous, but not known as final. That distinction matters. People are often careful with those who are kind and conclusive. They become careless with those who are kind and endlessly revisable. The cold truth is that fairness does not protect you by itself. Fairness is moral. Permission is behavioral. You can be deeply fair and still train others to expect endless accommodation if your fairness keeps outranking your self-protection. That does not mean care is weakness. It means care without structure becomes legible, and what becomes legible can become usable in the hands of people who place convenience above conscience. A person does not need to be evil to keep taking from someone who keeps yielding. Ordinary selfishness is enough. Ordinary comfort is enough. Ordinary human appetite will usually move wherever resistance appears weakest. This is the point where many people misdiagnose their suffering. They think the primary pain is being underestimated, ignored, manipulated, or taken for granted. That pain is real, but it is not the deepest layer. The deepest layer is the internal split that keeps converting recognition into delay. One part of you sees the pattern clearly. Another part still wants the pattern to mean something kinder than it does. One part wants dignity. Another wants one final piece of emotional proof that your patience was not wasted. One part knows the treatment is beneath your standards. Another is still bargaining for closure, still hoping the right explanation, the right timing, the right burst of tenderness will turn reality into a different story. That internal conflict is visible, not in the theatrical sense, but in the subtle signals that human beings constantly read. People feel the gap between what you understand and what you will actually enforce. They feel whether your standard is emotionally final or only intellectually correct. They feel whether your withdrawal is a true reordering or just a protest that can be softened with selective attention. They feel whether you are trying to leave the dynamic or only negotiate a version of it that hurts less. And once they sense that your longing can still delay your clarity, they do not need to overpower you. They only need to keep hope alive. Hope, in the wrong hands, is one of the cheapest tools in the world. It lets people maintain access without providing stability. It keeps you investing after the return has already been disproven. It turns inconsistency into suspense and suspense into attachment. That is why some of the hardest situations to leave are not the harshest ones, but the ones that alternate injury with relief. The relief feels like evidence. In truth, it often functions like maintenance. It keeps the system running. By the time most people finally act, they believe the action came from one last event. Usually, it did not. Usually, the last event merely exhausted their ability to keep translating what had already become obvious. The ending looks sudden to anyone who did not watch the pattern accumulate, but the truth is slower. Long before the departure, the mind had already been paying interest on a reality it refused to fully name. Long before the confrontation, the body had already learned the cost of staying available to what kept producing tension. Long before the line was drawn, the line had been crossed enough times to teach everyone involved what kind of relationship this really was. And that is why the next shift cannot be cosmetic. It cannot be another speech, another insight, another promise to yourself made in a tired moment. It has to be structural. It has to reach the place where your perception, your self-respect, and your behavior stop sending different messages. Until that happens, other people may hear your words, but they will continue trusting the older instructions your life keeps giving them. This is the moment where most people want a technique, because techniques feel safer than transformation. They want the right phrase, the right posture, the right boundary script, the right set of habits that will let them keep the same internal structure while producing a different external result. But life does not work that way for long. If identity remains old, tactics become costumes. They may work for an afternoon, a week, even a month. But pressure eventually exposes what is structural and what is theatrical. The world may not always be fair, but it is remarkably efficient at detecting inconsistency. It notices when a person is trying to perform certainty without yet inhabiting it. That is why true change starts in a place that feels almost invisible. The private negotiation you have with yourself before anyone else ever enters the room. Before the meeting, before the message, before the apology, before the decision to stay available or unavailable. The most decisive victories are often won there, in silence, where no one applauds and no one interrupts. That is where you either keep the old contract or break it. The old contract says your value must be explained, your standards must be justified, your discomfort must be proven, your exits must be softened, and your worth must remain flexible enough to preserve connection. The new contract says something simpler and far more dangerous to the people who benefited from the old one. Access will now follow reality, not hope. That kind of clarity creates a very specific form of power, not noisy power, not theatrical dominance, not the kind that needs to announce itself. Real power often looks quieter than most people expect. It looks like no longer rushing to fill the silence after someone disrespects the terms. It looks like not over-explaining the boundary to someone who only became interested once consequence appeared. It looks like refusing to defend your withdrawal to people who were content with your pain as long as it remained convenient for them. It looks like selective disclosure, deliberate movement, and an end to emotional leakage. You stop handing out maps to your uncertainty and calling it honesty. You stop narrating your every plan to those who have not earned proximity to it. You stop spending energy convincing spectators what only results can teach. Silence becomes important here, but not for performance. Silence is valuable because it interrupts a pattern many people never realize they are trapped inside, the pattern of bleeding authority through explanation. Every unnecessary defense teaches others that your position depends on their agreement. Every over-justified choice invites negotiation where there should have been recognition. Every anxious attempt to be fully understood by the wrong audience leaks leverage. There are people who never intended to understand you in good faith. They only needed your explanation to locate the exact point where your confidence became pliable. When you stop providing that material, something shifts. Mystery returns, not as manipulation, but as dignity. People have less to push against because you are no longer volunteering the blueprint of your doubt. And this is where the old self begins to panic. The old self was organized around manageability. It believed being good meant being endlessly interpretable, endlessly accommodating, endlessly available for review. It believed that strength required permission from the room. It believed that if you were patient enough, useful enough, reasonable enough, eventually everyone would see your value and treat you accordingly. But the world does not reward hidden standards. It responds to enacted standards. It does not study your intentions with much care. It studies your patterns. It studies whether you stay when you should leave, whether you explain when you should observe, whether you keep offering premium access to people who continue showing discount behavior. That realization can feel severe, but severity is not cruelty. It is accuracy without decoration. Once accuracy enters, your relationship with power begins to mature. You no longer imagine power as domination, aggression, or the fantasy of becoming untouchable in some absolute way. You begin to see power as congruence, the alignment of perception, self-image, and action. The refusal to let longing outrank evidence. The refusal to let guilt outrank peace. The refusal to keep financing old dynamics with new explanations. When that alignment stabilizes, people feel it. Rooms feel it. Negotiations feel it. Relationships feel it. Not because you become louder, but because there is less psychological movement available against you. From there, standards stop being goals and become law. A goal is something you reach toward when conditions are favorable. A standard is the floor beneath which you refuse to live. Goals inspire. Standards govern. Goals live in the future. Standards reorganize the present. The person who lives by goals often breaks under emotional weather. The person who lives by standards becomes much harder to bend because their identity no longer waits for motivation to arrive before behavior follows. They carry themselves according to the man or woman they have already decided to be. They do not need to feel ready every morning. They need to remain aligned. That is the beginning of becoming difficult to misuse, not impossible to wound, not immune to disappointment. Human life does not offer that fantasy, but difficult to organize against. Difficult to confuse into prolonged cooperation with what is clearly beneath your terms. Difficult to keep in suspense. Difficult to control with intermittent warmth, selective approval, strategic guilt, or the old promise that one more conversation will finally fix what repeated behavior has already made plain. You become less negotiable in the places where you used to dissolve. And when that happens, the world does begin to rearrange itself. Your decisions change. Your availability changes. Your timing changes. Some retreat, some resent you because your clarity removes benefits they once enjoyed. Some accuse you of changing, when what they really mean is that the old version of you was easier to use. Let them say it. They are describing the shift honestly. Because in the end, the difference between a manageable life and a powerful one is not talent alone, not effort alone, not charm, not intelligence, not luck. It is the moment your inner standards stop asking the outside world for permission to exist. At last. By now, the pattern is clear, but clarity alone is not freedom. Many people can describe exactly what has been happening to them and still remain available to it. They can name the manipulation, the neglect, the asymmetry, the slow corrosion of trust, and still answer the message, still reopen the door, still volunteer one more conversation in the name of fairness or closure, or loyalty to the version of the relationship they wanted to believe in. That is because the strongest chains are not always external. Sometimes they are woven from private motives so old and so familiar that they feel like personality. The need to be chosen, the need to be recognized, the need to prove that your love, your patience, your usefulness, your endurance were meaningful enough to transform the person who kept failing your standards. Until those motives are faced, the mind keeps feeding what the heart says it wants to escape. This is where the story becomes more ruthless, because now it is no longer only about what others saw in you. It is also about what you were still protecting inside yourself. Some people do not stay because they are weak. They stay because leaving requires a second loss. Not just the loss of the person, position, or possibility in front of them, but the loss of the story they built around it. Leaving means admitting that they hoped too long, translated too much, and kept calling delay discernment, because the alternative was to accept how much of their suffering had been extended by attachment to an image. For certain minds, that admission feels more threatening than the pattern itself, so they remain in negotiation with what should already be over. not because the truth is unclear, but because ending the dynamic also ends the illusion that their patience was guiding it toward redemption. And people feel that hunger more often than you think. Human beings are extraordinarily sensitive to unresolved need. They sense where your standards are real, but not final. They sense where your words have outgrown your nervous system. They sense whether your self-respect is embodied or only aspirational. That is why some people never push because they are stronger. They push because they can feel the gap between what you know and what you will do. They feel your wish to be fair. They feel your fear of looking cold. They feel your hope that one last explanation will make their behavior line up with their promises. And in that gap, many forms of exploitation become possible without ever needing open force. This is why the deepest shift is not aggression. The moment your perception, your values, and your behavior stop competing with one another. Until then, part of you is always leaking leverage. One part knows the truth, another keeps editing it. One part wants peace, another is still seduced by recognition. One part sees the pattern, another keeps waiting for a cleaner ending that will let you leave without mourning what your own hope cost you. Congruence ends that civil war. It does not remove grief, but it stops grief from making policy. The cost of that shift is real. When you become internally congruent, many things that once looked normal begin to feel unbearable. You notice how exhausting it was to over-explain every decision. You notice how often you called something complicated because naming it simply would have forced a simpler response. You notice how many relationships were being held together by your tolerance of hidden cost. And once you notice that clearly, you cannot continue without participating in your own erosion. That is why certain bonds collapse the moment one person changes internally. From the outside, it looks like a sudden rupture. From the inside, it is usually the end of unpaid labor. The dynamic was never as mutual as it appeared. It was stable because one person kept absorbing the confusion, funding the delay, cushioning the impact, and translating reality into softer terms so that everyone else could stay comfortable. When that person stops, the structure shakes. Then the truth comes out. But what they often mean is simpler. The old arrangement benefited them. That accusation can reach deep because it touches a fear many good people carry. They fear that if they stop cushioning everyone else's behavior, they will become bitter. They fear that if they stop giving endless chances, they will become loveless. They fear that accuracy will turn them cruel. But accuracy is not cruelty. Accuracy is the refusal to keep disguising repeated behavior in the language of possibility. Accuracy is recognizing that endurance, when disconnected from truth, becomes a way of helping other people remain exactly who they are. Accuracy is understanding that empathy is noble until it starts functioning as shelter for someone else's evasion. This is where self-respect begins to separate itself from image. Image wants to look powerful. Self-respect wants to live accurately. Image wants to appear unmoved. Self-respect wants to stop making decisions against evidence. Image is obsessed with how it is perceived. Self-respect is obsessed with whether inner truth and outer behavior agree. One is performance, the other is law. And only one of them can survive pressure without collapsing back into old bargains. So the task is not to become untouchable in the childish sense. It is to become uninterested in betraying yourself for access. It is to become less available to confusion, less fascinated by inconsistent people, less tempted to rescue your idea of someone from the evidence of who they keep being. It is to become difficult to hook with scarcity, guilt, projection, selective warmth, or the fantasy that your pain will eventually be rewarded with understanding, less explaining, fewer warnings. A steadier nervous system because it is no longer being asked to carry what your mind already knows is wrong. And when that happens, a different kind of authority emerges. Not the authority of intimidation, but the authority of someone who is on their own side. That is what people feel before they can name it. That is what changes rooms, negotiations, relationships, opportunities, and thresholds. Because the world does not only respond to what you say you deserve, it responds to the version of you that has become too aligned to keep offering discounts on your own value. In the end, the final change feels less like becoming more and more, like subtracting what was never serving you in the first place. Less second-guessing, less emotional labor spent trying to rescue your image of someone from the evidence of their pattern. Less fascination with hidden motives once repeated behavior has already made the motive irrelevant. Less explaining to people who only became attentive when access was threatened. Less repairing what you did not break, less translating disrespect into misunderstanding. The mind becomes quieter when it stops arguing with what it already knows, and that quiet is often the first unmistakable sign that your self-image has changed. From there, behavior simplifies. You do not have to perform distance, you create it. You do not have to threaten consequences, you become one. You do not have to tell people how much you matter. The terms of access begin carrying that message for you. This is the point where the world seems to rearrange itself, and to anyone watching from the outside it can look sudden, almost mystical. But there is nothing mystical about it. The rearrangement is built from mechanics. Your availability changes. Your timing changes. Your responses change. Your standards stop being essays and become environments. People who relied on your permeability encounter new friction and are forced to update their reading of you or lose their place near you. That is the real social shift most people spend years misunderstanding. The world does not respond most strongly to what you announce. It responds to what becomes expensive around you. It responds when confusion no longer buys time. It responds when selective affection no longer buys forgiveness. It responds when guilt no longer buys access. It responds when your empathy stops operating as a discount code for other people's evasions. At that point, some relationships deepen because the people in them were capable of respect and only needed clearer terms. Some relationships fade because they were built more on your flexibility than on mutual regard. Some opportunities multiply because confidence without desperation is easier to trust. Some doors close because they were never meant for the version of you that stopped volunteering for hidden cost. This is why inner change can feel like loss before it feels like power. There are habits you can no longer indulge, including the habit of revisiting what your perception has already settled. There are people you can no longer romanticize because reality has outlived your preferred interpretation. There are environments that begin to suffocate you, not because they changed overnight, but because your tolerance for self-betrayal finally weakened. That discomfort is not failure. It is friction between an old structure and a new standard. It is the nervous system adjusting to accuracy after years of adaptation to ambiguity. And accuracy changes more than your relationships. It changes your ambition. The old self often chased from hunger, from lack, from the fear of being overlooked, from the need to prove worth to invisible judges who had been living in the mind for years. The new self moves differently, not lazily, not arrogantly, but from internal law. The need for applause weakens. The addiction to being understood weakens. The impulse to announce every plan weakens. Silence becomes less about hiding and more about integrity. You begin to understand why those with real power often move without fanfare. They are not starved for witness. They are organized by direction. They know that a standard maintained in private will eventually become visible in public without begging to be believed in advance. That is also why being misunderstood stops feeling like a crisis. There will always be people who interpret your certainty as arrogance, your selectivity as coldness, your boundaries as hostility, your silence as distance, your refusal to over-explain as ego. Let them. Many judgments are simply reactions to reduced access. The mistake is thinking every misreading must be corrected. It does not. Some perceptions dissolve on their own when time reveals the structure beneath your choices. Others never dissolve, and that is fine too. A life built on accurate standards cannot be governed by the demand to be read correctly by everyone standing outside them. By then, you begin to notice something subtle but decisive. You trust your own perception faster. You stop requiring overwhelming proof before allowing yourself to act. You stop treating every red flag like a philosophical question. You stop needing a courtroom for every boundary, a eulogy for every disappointment, a speech for every withdrawal, a moral dissertation for every ending. You recognize that people show themselves gradually, often long before they confess themselves. And once that becomes real in you, much of what used to trap you loses leverage because it no longer gets the benefit of your delay. Then the final lesson arrives. The world did not become kinder. Human nature did not suddenly transform. There are still selfish, evasive, manipulative, opportunistic people, and people whose warmth is sincere only when it costs them nothing. But the field they are entering has changed. Your self-image no longer collaborates with what once fed on your uncertainty. The entry points are gone. The delays are gone. The bargain is gone. Your boundaries are no longer written in guilt, and your worth is no longer offered on probation. That is why some people stop trying, not because they became moral, but because the environment no longer rewards the attempt. And this is the deeper rearrangement. Not that every door opens, not that every person stays, not that life becomes smooth, fair, or free of disappointment. It is deeper than that. You stop helping reality oppose you. You stop participating in your own dilution. You stop offering your body, your care, your labor, your hope, and your language to patterns that have already disqualified themselves. You become more congruent, more internally lawful. And from that place, your life begins to gather evidence. Different people, different outcomes. Not because you performed power, but because you finally stopped living as someone willing to betray themselves for belonging. So if there is one truth worth carrying forward, it is this. The world changes around you the moment your self-image stops negotiating with what your soul has already judged. That is when confusion loses its glamour. That is when delay loses its excuses. That is when access stops being automatic and starts being earned. That is when your silence gains weight, your choices gain coherence, your standards gain consequence, and your presence begins saying something your explanations never could. Not everyone will like that version of you. Not everyone is supposed to. The ones who only knew how to meet you through your uncertainty will call it distance. The ones who benefited from your old softness will call it hardness. The ones who confused your patience for permission will call it change. Let them call it whatever they need. And once that message is real, much of what used to happen around you cannot happen in the same way again.